The chrome top, the cream body, the black mix finder dial, 2 chrome beaters, 10 speeds, 230 volts, 120 watts, heavy cast metal, built to last 40 years. And it did. Model 9B, chugging on the kitchen bench of every Australian mother from 1948 through the 1980s. Pavlova, sponge cake, Christmas cream, every Sunday roast dessert, every Country Women's Association bake-off entry. 725,000 Mixmasters, sold to Australian households between 1948 and 1958. Roughly 1 in every 4 homes. The most Australian object ever assembled on this continent. Then in July 2002, after 50 years of continuous Sydney manufacturing, the Campsie factory closed, all manufacturing offshored to China. An American CEO called Chainsaw Al, a $500,000 SEC settlement. No criminal charges, not one. His personal fortune untouched. How does Australia's #1 mixer empire become a supermarket? Before we go any further, if you want to keep these stories alive, I have created a book with the complete Australian lost factories. The workers, the gates, the Australian maid, all gone. The link is on the first line of the description. Back to the story. Chapter 1. The Sheep Shearing Yard at 16 Young Street. 1902, Sydney. Not a mixer factory, not an appliance company, not an Australian startup. A branch office of an American company from Chicago. The Chicago Flexible Shaft Company had been founded 5 years earlier in 1897 by John K. Stewart and Thomas J. Clark. Their business was horse clipping, sheep shearing, flexible drive shafts for the wool and pastoral trades. Australia in 1902 was the largest wool producer in the world, 60 million sheep. Australian wool clip supplied the mills of Bradford, Manchester and Osaka. Australian shearing gear was, at the turn of the 20th century, the most technologically advanced pastoral machinery on earth. If you sold sheep shearing gear, Sydney was the natural branch office. The Chicago Flexible Shaft Company opened its Sydney branch around 1902. Some sources say 1904. The exact year is disputed, but by 1909 the operation had been re-registered by Richard Powell Cooper and his son Richard Ashmole Cooper as the Cooper Engineering Company. Address 16 Young Street, Sydney. Sheep shearers, wool presses, flexible shafts, not mixers, not toasters, not appliances. The company sold and serviced American-designed shearing gear to Australian graziers across New South Wales, Victoria and Queensland. Cooper Engineering was a name every wool broker knew. Here is the kicker. The Chicago Flexible Shaft Company, back in Illinois, would take another 11 years, until 1910, to launch its first small electrical appliance. The Princess Electric Iron. The Sunbeam name itself came from a company-wide contest in that same year, won by a traffic manager named Edwin J. Gallagher. He received $1,000. The Australian branch stayed a shearing company for the next quarter century. But Cooper Engineering was learning something. That an American parent, 3 decades old, was expanding into the domestic appliance market. That the Australian tariff regime and the sterling dollar exchange controls would eventually make importing American appliances impossible. That the Australian branch would have to build things locally or die. Chapter 2. Horace Caldwell Wright, Sydney to Chicago, 1923. Horace Caldwell Wright, Managing Director of Cooper Engineering, boarded a steamer at Sydney Harbour and sailed for the United States. 12,000 miles. He arrived in Chicago and became Vice President of the Chicago Flexible Shaft Company. Wright was not returning home. He had never been American. but he had come to represent Sydney interests inside the Chicago boardroom. Over the next 23 years, Wright climbed the American parent. Vice President, President, then Chairman. And in 1946, at Wright's chairmanship, the Chicago Flexible Shaft Company formally renamed itself Sunbeam Corporation. The Australian who had run the Sydney branch since before the First World War was, in 1946, the American parent's chairman when it took the Sunbeam name. The corporate lineage, Sydney to Chicago, Chicago back to Sydney, ran through Wright. Meanwhile, in Sydney, Cooper Engineering had been quietly learning to manufacture. In 1933, driven by exchange rate movements and tariff changes, Cooper began local manufacturing of engines and shearing gear at its Sydney and Melbourne branches, verbatim from the Cooper Engineering 1942 catalogue on the Cooper Type JM engine. Quote, "The Cooper Type JM is an exact reproduction of a famous American engine, the Johnson Iron Horse. We decided to build it locally when restrictions were placed on non-sterling countries. The JM is 100% Australian-made. This is the pattern, American design, Australian labour, local manufacturing forced not by Australian ambition, but by Australian trade policy. The Mixmaster was still 6 years away." Chapter 3, Wartime, 1942, Chicago. While Cooper Engineering in Sydney continued making shearing gear, the American parent went to war. Chairman Horace Caldwell Wright, the man who had left Sydney in 1923, converted the entire Sunbeam Chicago complex to war production. 5,400 to 5,600 West Roosevelt Road, Cicero, Illinois. The Sunbeam wartime output, quote, "shot, fuses, shells, gun-loading mechanisms and precision instruments for airplanes. 2 million square feet of Chicago factory floor, converted from making Mixmasters and shearing gear to making artillery fuses and aircraft instrument precision components. Wool, meanwhile, was needed for uniforms and blankets. Sheep shearing machines stayed in production. The Sydney branch kept making Cooper shearing gear for a wool industry supplying the Australian Imperial Force in North Africa, New Guinea and the Middle East. In 1943, the Chicago Flexible Shaft Company received the Army-Navy E Award, the Industrial Excellence Citation for wartime production. The award ceremony was held at the Roosevelt Road complex. 4,000 workers received a lapel pin. Wright received the corporate flag on behalf of the company. 2 war economies, 1 corporate name, same industrial logic. Take American design, make it locally, sell it to a captive domestic market. 1945. The war ended. 1946. Wright's Chicago Flexible Shaft renamed itself Sunbeam Corporation. 1947. The Chifley Labor government of Australia, facing a sterling dollar crisis, tightened import restrictions on American goods. Australian sterling reserves had been drained by the war. American appliances required US dollars, which Australia did not have. American appliances could not be freely imported into Australia. The post-war Australian consumer wanted a Mixmaster. The post-war Australian government could not let Australian dollars pay for one, and American Sunbeam Corporation could not sell to Australia without local manufacturing. 1948. Cooper Engineering, the Australian subsidiary, began manufacturing the Sunbeam Mixmaster in Sydney, not because Australians had invented it, because Australians could no longer buy the American one. Chapter 4. Ivar Jepson's Machine, Chicago, 1929. 19 years before the first Australian Mixmaster. Ivar Jepson, Swedish-born, 1903, chief designer and later head of engineering at the Chicago Flexible Shaft Company, files a patent. An electric food mixer. 2 interlocking, detachable beaters. 10 speeds, cast steel body. A rotating turntable that eliminated the need to move the bowl by hand. Jeppson had emigrated from Sweden as a boy. He rose to chief designer at Chicago Flexible Shaft in his mid-20s. Would remain chief engineer at Sunbeam through 1956 and vice president of research and development until his 1963 retirement. The first mass-produced Mixmaster hit American stores in 1930, the Depression era's most successful new kitchen appliance. His Mixmaster would go on to sell tens of millions of units globally over the next 70 years. The United States Postal Service issued a commemorative stamp of the 1930s ivory Mixmaster with green glass bowls in 1998. The original ivory and green Mixmaster of the 1930s, with its distinctive Art Deco silhouette and mixing bowl of tinted glass, became one of the most recognizable industrial design objects of the 20th century. 50 years after its release, it was still on kitchen benches across 2 continents. The Smithsonian holds one at the Cooper Hewitt National Design Museum. So does the Chicago History Museum. So does the Powerhouse Museum in Sydney. But in 1948, when Cooper Engineering in Sydney began building the Australian Mixmaster, Jeppson's design was already 19 years old. The Australian version was the Model 9B, not a new design. A licensed reproduction of an American original from 1929. 10 speeds, chrome-plated beaters, 230 to 250 volts, AC or DC, 50 cycles, 120 watts at high speed. Heavy cast metal casing, cream enamel body, chrome top. Sunbeam's own records state the launch price was more than a month's wages for an average Australian household, an enormous purchase, but Australia bought it anyway. Chapter 5, Model 9B, 1948, Sydney. The first Australian-made Sunbeam Mixmaster rolls off the Cooper Engineering assembly line. Model 9B. The chrome top catches the electric light of a 1948 showroom. The cream body sits solid on the workshop bench. The 2 chrome beaters lock into the head with an audible click. The black mix finder dial reads off, then 1 through 10. The motor hums at 120 watts. Weight? Heavy. Cast metal. Built to last 40 years. Price? More than a month's wages. Marketed to the post-war Australian housewife through the Australian Women's Weekly. Full-page colour advertisements on the inside cover. The Mixmaster as symbol of post-war domestic modernity. Electric. American designed. Australian made. Chrome. Cream. Available on hire purchase from Grace Brothers, from David Jones, from every hardware store and every appliance retailer from Cairns to Hobart. Read that again. In just 10 years, from 1948 to 1958, Sunbeam's own corporate records state that 725,000 Mixmasters were sold to Australian households. In a country of roughly 3 million households at the time, roughly 1 in every 4 Australian homes owned a Mixmaster, higher household penetration than the Holden. Higher household penetration than the electric washing machine, the refrigerator, the television. In the first decade of its availability, the Mixmaster was not a purchase. The Mixmaster was a life event. Every Australian mother knew where hers was on the kitchen bench. Every Australian daughter learned to fold cream on hers by the age of 12. Every Australian pavlova between 1950 and 1995 was whipped on a Sunbeam Mixmaster. The Mixmaster became a wedding gift, a 21st birthday gift, a hire purchase, Christmas Eve delivery from Grace Brothers. The chrome top was the centrepiece of the modern Australian kitchen, more visible than the electric jug, more valued than the toaster, more permanent than the electric clock. When a young couple bought their first house in the western suburbs of Sydney in 1955, the Mixmaster went on the bench first. The rest of the kitchen was built around it. The Australian Food Timeline records it plainly. The Sunbeam Mixmaster was, quote, considered essential equipment for preparing that Australian classic, the pavlova, not one of many essential mixers. The essential mixer, the default mixer, the mixer. Chapter 6. Sunbeam becomes Sunbeam. 12th of December 1952. The Australian subsidiary Cooper Engineering Company Limited formally changes its name to Sunbeam Corporation. The corporate registration is filed with the New South Wales Registrar of Companies. The Sydney Stock Exchange lists the new name. The Australian entity becomes publicly traded. The Cooper family surname, carried by the company since 1909, is retired. Horace Caldwell Wright's 40-year Chicago-Sydney thread is complete. The Australian company that had begun as a Chicago shearing branch, then run for 2 generations as Cooper Engineering, is now Sunbeam Corporation. Both hemispheres, one name. But the Australian consumer is not told. The Sunbeam badge on the Model 9B, a stylised sunrise, is assumed by every Australian mother to represent an Australian company. Read the corporate structure and it says otherwise. Sunbeam Corporation Australia is 100% owned by Sunbeam Corporation Incorporated, headquartered at Roosevelt Road in Cicero, Illinois. Every Mixmaster sold in Sydney sends a royalty back to Chicago. Every design change is approved by American engineers. The Australian company is manufacturing on Australian soil. But the intellectual property, the design authority, and the ultimate control sit in a Chicago boardroom 12,000 miles away. This is the pattern Cooper Engineering had already described in 1942. We decided to build it locally when restrictions were placed on non-sterling countries. The Sunbeam Empire in Australia was assembly, not sovereignty. Chapter 7. The Kitchen Empire, 1952 to 1990. 38 years of dominance. The Mixmaster was the flagship, but the range expanded. 1955, the first Australian pop-up toaster, based on Sunbeam engineer Ludwig J. Kochi's Radiant Control design, patented in 1948. The T-Series toaster, no timer. Bread lowered by its own weight. Radiant heat sensing. When the bread reached the correct temperature, the mechanism released and the toast rose silently. Marketing slogan verbatim from a 1955 advertisement. Automatic beyond belief. The Radiant Controlled toaster alongside the Mixmaster 9B became fixtures of the Australian kitchen bench through the 50s, 60s and 70s. Electric fry pans. Kettles. The Lady Sunbeam hairdryer, advertised as the accessory for the modern Australian woman. Blenders after Sunbeam USA acquired the John Oster Manufacturing Company in 1960. Clock radios, electric knives, heaters, electric razors. By the end of the 1970s, Sunbeam's US parent had grown into what the Chicago Industrial Press called America's biggest producer of small appliances. Over $1.3 billion in annual revenue, more than 75 factories worldwide, roughly 30,000 employees, just 3,000 of them still in Chicago. The Campsie factory grew alongside it, 5.5 hectares. Bounded by Charlotte Street to the west, Sunbeam Street to the north, Harp Street to the south. Between Campsie and Clempton Park, 13 kilometres southwest of the Sydney Central Business District. Before Sunbeam owned it, the land had been Mackinder's Market Garden. Potatoes, beetroot, carrots, pumpkin, squash. A 5.5 hectare grower's paddock supplying the Sydney fruit and vegetable market at Haymarket. Sunbeam bought the land in 1951, the year before the corporate rename, and cleared it for the appliance plant. The Powerhouse Museum in Sydney holds an aerial photograph of the Campsie factory dated the 9th of July, 1962. Object number 472009. You can see the layout. the main manufacturing building, the parking lot, the rail siding, the warehouse, the workers' entrance on Charlotte Street. This was the Australian appliance industry's largest single-site plant. By the 1990s, Victor Lawn Care, the Australian lawnmower company, was part of the Sunbeam Victor Group. Victor Lawnmower operations moved on to the Campsie site in 1994. The 7 millionth Victor mower was built at Campsie in 1997. 1980, Sunbeam Australia's first Australian-based designer. Ian Wilson joins as a design draftsman. 1981, Wilson designs the Mixmaster MX001, the first Mixmaster fully designed in Australia. A cost-reduction redesign of the classic 9B, the MX001 stays on the Australian market for over 20 years. 1983, Wilson designs the Express Fast Boil Kettle, then the Express Plus in 1985 to 86. 1985, the first Australian outdoor electric barbecue. 1993, the first Australian pie maker. The Campsie plant is running multiple production shifts, employing generations of Sydney families. The Mixmaster is now on the kitchen bench of every Australian family, including the third generation of the post-war boom families who bought their first 9B in 1950. The empire is at its peak. 1987, the Australian operation becomes Australian-owned for the first time in 85 years. The Chicago parent divests the Australian subsidiary. Sunbeam Australia is finally, briefly, actually Australian. For 9 years. Chapter 8, Chainsaw Al, 18th of July, 1996. Sunbeam Corporation Incorporated of the United States, the Chicago-based parent that had spun off the Australian subsidiary 9 years earlier, names a new chairman and chief executive officer. Albert John Dunlap, born 26th of July, 1937, in Hoboken, New Jersey. West Point graduate, career pattern, hostile turnarounds. Lily Tulip, Crown Zellerbach, Diamond International, Scott Paper. Dunlap's playbook was published. He wrote a best-selling business book called Mean Business in 1996, arguing that companies exist to maximize shareholder value and nothing else. Employees, in Dunlap's own words, were cost centers. Communities were sentimental attachments. Long-term investment in factories was wasted capital. The chief executive's job was to close, cut and sell as fast as possible, extracting maximum value in the shortest time. At Scott Paper, where he was CEO from 1994 to 1995, Dunlap fired nearly 11,000 workers, shed $2 billion of assets. When Kimberly-Clark completed its acquisition of Scott Paper on the 12th of December 1995 for approximately $9.4 billion, Dunlap walked away with approximately $100 million in stock and severance. His trade press nicknames: Chainsaw Al, Rambo in pinstripes, the Shredder. He posed for magazine covers holding a rifle. He posed with a chainsaw. He wore the nicknames like decorations. On the day Dunlap's appointment to Sunbeam was announced, 18th of July 1996, Sunbeam's New York Stock Exchange share price jumped 59%. Overnight. Read that again. 59% overnight. The largest single-day increase in New York Stock Exchange history at that point, based solely on a chief executive appointment. The market cheered Chainsaw Al's arrival. 4 months later, 12th of November 1996, Dunlap announced the plan. Cut half of Sunbeam's 12,000 jobs. Close 18 of the 26 factories worldwide. Drop 87% of the product range. 6,000 jobs announced in one day. United States Labor Secretary Robert Reich on the record verbatim. There is no excuse for treating employees as if they are disposable pieces of equipment. Dunlap's paper profit on Sunbeam stock options, approximately $50 million, on top of the $100 million he had made at Scott Paper the year before. Meanwhile, in Sydney, the Australian subsidiary, which had been operating independently under Australian ownership since 1987, was acquired by GUD Holdings, a Melbourne-based Australian industrial conglomerate, in 1996, the same year Dunlap arrived at the American parent. The Australian company was at that moment still Australian-owned. But the brand, the licensing arrangements, the design specifications, and the strategic global direction all flowed through the American parent, and the American parent was about to collapse. Chapter 9. The Fraud. 1997. Sunbeam Corporation reports record earnings. $109.4 million in net income. The stock peaks at approximately $52. Market capitalization approaches $4.6 billion. Chainsaw Al is on the cover of every business magazine in America. Fortune, Businessweek, The Wall Street Journal. He has fired half the workforce, closed most of the factories, restored the share price. This is what shareholder value looks like. Then the accounting came apart. In 1998, the United States Securities and Exchange Commission opened an investigation. The 1997 earnings, reported at $109.4 million, were restated down to $38.3 million. $60 million of 1997 earnings had been fraudulent. The techniques were textbook: channel stuffing, booking products shipped to distributors as final sales, even though those distributors could return it. Bill and hold sales, invoicing customers for product that had not yet shipped and would not ship for months. Cookie jar reserves, parking earnings from one quarter into a reserve account, then releasing them into future quarters when the numbers needed a boost. The pattern was straightforward. Barbecue grills invoiced to distributors at year-end, with side agreements allowing return the following summer. Products sitting in warehouses booked as sales. Reserves shifted from quarter to quarter to smooth the earnings line. The books read as record profits. The reality was that Sunbeam was selling next year's inventory this year over and over until the trick collapsed. SEC Enforcement Director Thomas Newkirk on the record after the settlement was announced. Dunlap and his cronies' actions led to a market cap peak for Sunbeam of $5 billion. Today, it's zilch. Here's the thing. On the 13th of June, 1998, the Sunbeam Board of Directors fired Chainsaw Al Dunlap. But by then, the damage was done. Sunbeam's balance sheet was fiction. The 18 closed factories were closed. The 6,000 fired workers were gone. On the 6th of February, 2001, Sunbeam Corporation filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. On the 15th of May, 2001, the SEC sued Dunlap. On the 4th of September, 2002, Dunlap settled with the SEC. The terms: $500,000 civil penalty. Permanent bar from serving as an officer or director of any US public company, neither admitting nor denying wrongdoing. No criminal charges were ever filed. Dunlap's personal fortune from Scott Paper plus Sunbeam, over $150 million, remained intact. The auditor, Arthur Anderson, settled a parallel investor lawsuit for $110 million. Dunlap personally paid $15 million into the shareholder class action. He kept the rest. Sunbeam Corporation emerged from bankruptcy in 2002 as American Household Incorporated. The household appliance division became Sunbeam Products Incorporated. The Australian subsidiary, GUD, owned since 1996, was collateral damage. Chapter 10. July 2002. Meanwhile, 12,000 kilometres south, Campsie, Sydney. The 5.5-hectare block bounded by Charlotte Street and Sunbeam Street and Harp Street, owned by Sunbeam since 1951. Before that, Mackinder's Market Garden, potatoes, beetroot, carrots, pumpkin, squash. 50 years of continuous appliance manufacturing. 2 production lines, the Mixmaster line, the Victor lawnmower line, moved onto the Campsie site in 1994. July 2002, 5 months after the American parent filed for Chapter 11. 10 months before Dunlap's SEC settlement. GUD Holdings announced that the Campsie factory would close. All manufacturing offshored. To China. 50 years of continuous Sydney manufacturing. Ended. The Powerhouse Museum records the closure in its curatorial notes on the Mixmaster. Sunbeam's Campsie factory closed in July 2002 and the company was substantially restructured and all manufacturing moved offshore. The workers were made redundant with statutory entitlements. The specific number, the specific names, and the union statements from the closure day are not preserved in accessible public archives. What is preserved is the site itself, the Powerhouse Museum's institutional record of the closure, and the closure of the wider Australian small appliance manufacturing sector that had begun contracting through the 1990s as retailers shifted to imported product. Cambrook and Breville, the Australian-designed competitors, were themselves pivoting away from Australian manufacturing in the same period. The Campsie closure was not the first in the sector. It was one of the last of the post-war era. Only a design studio at Botany, New South Wales survived, 20 kilometres east of Campsie. The studio where Sunbeam's designers, Ian Wilson, Richard Hoare, Ian Allen, Nick Edmonds, had drawn the retro-styled Mixmaster Professional A800 in 2001, as a homage to the 1940s and 50s originals. The Professional was launched in 2002, made not in Campsie, but in China. The plant closed, the land was sold, and it was redeveloped as Clempton Park Village, a Woolworths, a shopping centre and apartments. The address of the shopping centre today is 60 Charlotte Street, Campsie, New South Wales, 2194. Internal streets of the residential development were given the names Sunbeam Street, Troy Street and Mackinder Street, a token gesture to the vanished factory and the market garden that preceded it. 12 years later, in November 2014, GUD Holdings sold 49% of Sunbeam ANZ to its US partner Sunbeam Products Incorporated, by then part of Jarden Corporation. In 2016, GUD sold the remaining 51%. Total GUD exit from Sunbeam ANZ across both transactions, approximately 35 million Australian dollars. Jonathan Ling, GUD Managing Director, told SBS in 2016, and I quote verbatim, "It's just gotten to be a very tough business that is dominated now by global players, and just being a little Australian, it's too hard to survive." Chapter 11. Where the Mixmaster Went, 2026. Walk to Charlotte, Street Campsie. The 5.5 hectare Sunbeam site is now Clempton Park Village, 60 Charlotte Street. A Woolworths, apartment lobbies, concrete driveways, a pedestrian plaza, where the Mixmaster line rolled from 1948 to 2002, a supermarket checkout. Where the Victor lawnmower line rolled from 1994 to 2002, apartment car parks. Where generations of Campsie families worked multiple shifts a day, apartment lobbies with security cameras and CCTV. Internal streets, Sunbeam Street, Troy Street, Mackinder Street, named for a factory that closed and a market garden that preceded it. Nothing else survives on the ground. The train station is a 5-minute walk. Campsie is now one of the most ethnically diverse suburbs in Sydney. Korean, Chinese, Vietnamese and Lebanese families, living in the apartments that stand where the Mixmaster came off the line. Most of them arrived in Australia after the Campsie factory had already closed. They have no memory of the plant. To them, 60 Charlotte Street is where you buy your groceries. No plaque. The Powerhouse Museum in Sydney holds the archive. Object 2, 61357. Cooper Engineering Mixmaster Model 9B, circa 1950. Chrome top, cream body, black mix finder dial, 2 chrome beaters. The Sacred Artifact, Object 72408. The Mixmaster MS001, designed by Ian Wilson in 1981, the first Mixmaster designed in Australia, Object 355448. The Mixmaster Professional MX8800, designed at Botany. In 2001, made in China from 2002. Object 472009. The 1962 aerial photograph of the Campsie factory, 5.5 hectares in black and white, sawtooth roofed, at industrial peak. Object 11737. The Cooper Engineering, Sunbeam and Victor Corporate Archive. Design drawings, photographs, brochures, prototypes. Object 638207. Mark Newson's 2015 limited edition Sunbeam toaster. Newson's first and only toaster design. Retail run of a few thousand units. The Powerhouse Museum sits at 500 Harris Street, Ultimo. 12 kilometres northeast of Campsie. Roughly half an hour by train. No plaque for Cooper Engineering. No plaque for Horace Caldwell Wright's 40-year Sydney to Chicago thread. No plaque for the 1933 decision to begin local manufacturing. No plaque for the 725,000 Mixmasters sold in 10 years. No plaque for Ian Wilson's 20-year M001 design. No plaque for the Campsie families who worked the line for 50 years. But on any Australian kitchen bench built between 1948 and 1990, the chrome-topped Mixmaster is still there. Second hand, family heirloom. Passed down from a grandmother who bought her Model 9B in 1955 for more than a month's wages. Still working, still mixing, still whipping pavlova on a Saturday afternoon, still humming at 120 watts. Chrome-topped Mixmasters from the 1950s turn up regularly on eBay, at Salvos, at Vinnie's, at every Sunday morning garage sale in every Sydney suburb. $20, sometimes $40, sometimes cleaned up and restored by hobbyists to auction condition, listed as vintage kitchenalia at $200 or $300. The cast metal motor still turns after 70 years. The chrome still polishes to a mirror. The mix finder dial still reads off through 10. The 2 beaters still lock into the head with an audible click. Sunbeam branded appliances today are made in China, sold by a marketing office in Botany, New South Wales. Trademark owner, Newell Brands Incorporated. Registered address, 6655 Peachtree Dunwoody Road, Sandy Springs, in metropolitan Atlanta, Georgia. The same corporate parent that owns Coleman, that owns Esky, that absorbed Jarden in April 2016. The kitchen bench remembers. The factory does not. Lesson 1. Sovereignty is not the same as assembly. For 54 years, from 1948 to 2002, the Sunbeam Mixmaster was assembled in Australia. Australians assumed it was an Australian product. It was not. It was designed in Chicago in 1929 by a Swedish-born engineer named Ivar Jeppsson, working for a Chicago sheep shearing company. Assembled in Sydney under licence from 1948. Renamed after its American parent in December 1952. Owned outright by the Chicago parent until 1987. 85 years of continuous American corporate control. When the American parent went bankrupt in February 2001 under Chainsaw Al Dunlap's SEC-settled accounting fraud, the Australian subsidiary was collateral damage. The Campsie factory closed in July 2002, not because Australians stopped buying Mixmasters. Australians never stopped buying Mixmasters. The Campsie factory closed because the American parent had been destroyed by a chief executive who received a $500,000 SEC civil penalty and a permanent bar from serving as an officer of a public company, but never a single criminal charge, never a day in prison, never a serious financial penalty against the fortune he had built firing 11,000 workers at Scott Paper and 6,000 at Sunbeam. Sovereignty is not the same as assembly. Assembly can be ended by a boardroom in Chicago or a bankruptcy court in Delaware, no matter how many Mixmasters are sitting on Australian kitchen benches. Lesson 2. Chainsaw capitalism is a style, not an aberration. Al Dunlap was not one bad man. He was one incarnation of an ongoing management ideology. Fire half the workforce, close half the factories, drop most of the products, cut costs to boost the share price to the personal benefit of the chief executive's stock options, sell, move on. He had done it at Lily Tulip, at Crown Zellerbach, at Diamond International, at Scott Paper, where he made $100 million and fired 11,000 workers before Kimberly-Clark bought the wreckage for $9.4 billion in December 1995. Then he did it at Sunbeam. Billions of dollars in market capitalization, thousands of jobs, and 18 factories were destroyed in less than 2 years. The Sunbeam market cap peaked at roughly $5 billion. By the 2001 bankruptcy, it was zero. When the accounting fraud collapsed, he settled with the SEC for $500,000. $500,000. Less than 1% of the $50 million in paper profit he had made on Sunbeam options alone. His personal fortune from Scott Paper plus Sunbeam, over $150 million, remained intact. He faced no criminal charges. He died in January 2019, aged 81, on a working horse ranch in Ocala, Florida. The Campsie workers who lost their jobs in July 2002 as a downstream consequence of his management style were not consulted. The ideology continues. It has other names now: private equity, activist investing, shareholder value, portfolio rationalization. The vocabulary changes. The result does not. Australian manufacturing is exposed to chainsaw capitalism in a way most Australians do not realise, because the parent companies of Australian brands are not Australian. Chrysler was Detroit. Nilex was Kansas. Sunbeam was Chicago. The trademark sits in Sandy Springs. The factory sits in Campsie. When Sandy Springs sneezes, Campsie closes. The exposure is asymmetric. An American corporate decision made in a Delaware boardroom can trigger, 6 months later, the closure of an Australian factory that has operated continuously for 50 years. The Australian workers do not have a vote in Delaware. The Delaware board does not have a stake in Campsie. But the decisions flow one way only, from north to south, and the consequences flow one way only, from parent to subsidiary. The Campsie closure was not unique. Since the mid-1990s, many Australian factories have been closed by American, European or Asian parents. Each closure was described in the annual report as portfolio rationalisation. Each closure was, on the ground in Campsie or Broadmeadows or Elizabeth or Somerton, the same thing. Australians losing their jobs because a foreign boardroom decided the numbers no longer worked. The style continues. The Australian factories keep closing. Lesson 3. The chrome top survives. The country that assembled it does not. Model 9. B. Object 2, 61357 at the Powerhouse Museum in Sydney. Chrome top. Cream body. Black mix finder dial. 2 chrome-plated beaters. 230 volts. 120 watts. 10 speeds. Heavy cast metal built to last 40 years. And it did. 725,000 units sold in the first 10 years alone. Roughly 1 in every 4 Australian households by 1958. Every Australian family kitchen from 1948 through the 1980s. Every pavlova, every sponge, every Christmas cream. The Sunbeam Mixmaster still sits on second-hand shelves at every Salvos, every Vinnie's, every op shop in every Sydney suburb. $20, sometimes $40. Still working, still whipping pavlova on the same 1950s cast metal motor. The chrome top survives. The factory does not. The Campsie site is a Woolworths. The families who worked the line are not recorded. The ownership is a marketing office in Botany, reporting to a corporate parent in Sandy Springs, Georgia. The country that assembled the Mixmaster for 54 years does not exist anymore. Not as a manufacturing country. Not as a country that could build another chrome-topped, cream-bodied, 10-speed food mixer from Australian steel, Australian labour and Australian design. The Mixmaster is a museum object now behind glass at 500 Harris Street, Ultimo, Sydney. Object 261357, 725,000 Mixmasters, chrome top, cream body, made in Sydney, sold to Newell Brands. The kitchen bench remembers, the factory does not.